All right, hello everybody, and we are live. Thank God for scheduled tweeting, so you don't have to see me on my phone right quickly before we go live. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest and a gentleman that I've had the great pleasure of speaking with before. But for those of you who don't know, I'm joined by Grayson Quay, and for those of you who don't know, I'll let the good fine gentleman introduce himself. Grayson, how are you?
Hi, doing well today. Thank you for having me on. Yeah, so as our kind host said, I'm Grayson Quay. My title is Weekend Editor at The Week, which sounds like a made-up job, like the tomorrow editor of the Today Show or something. But yeah, I'm the weekend editor at The Week, and then I'm a columnist at the Spectator World as well. So I write weekly-ish for them, and then at The Week, I'm just kind of cranking out sort of short news content and like explainers. Whereas I'm kind of writing opinion stuff at the Spectator World, so that's where I really get to have fun.
Yeah, it's always fun with the opinion pieces rather than the breakdowns. And it's kind of funny that we planned having this discussion. I think Monday morning is that I was just like, "Hey, do you want to come on and maybe talk about this Vanity Fair article?" And
Yeah.
then really the bigger news dropped Monday
Yeah.
afternoon. So it's almost as if my rank punditry is out of order because we did talk about it on the channel, the sort of SCOTUS leaks that had came out. But I guess we can talk about that just for like a minute or two before diving in. I mean,
What, the SCOTUS Lakes? Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Oh man.
you and I both have a very fervently pro-life position, and it's nice to see you dunking on people on Twitter because of it. But yeah, I mean, there's been some discussion now since the leaks had emerged that it has sucked the wind out of the sails, maybe potentially out of the pro-life movement, because it is one of the most well-organized, well-funded parts that sort of the right in America has. And now you give them their win. Will this be sort of the traditional moral victory, political release valve, or will more action be taken? Because there are plenty of social league-minded people that will be like, well, we have to talk about how men act, how women are, contraception. But that's the real question: is it a release valve, or is this really just maybe more?
So I don't know if I think that this is like, oh well, this is a huge kind of political defeat for the right necessarily, because I think that the left simply can't help themselves. They can't bear the idea that there might be some people in states they don't live in that can't kill their baby right up until birth. So I think they're going to have to just as a shibboleth, as the barrier to entry, going to have to in every campaign push for a federal abortion law. And I think that as long as that threat is there, the pro-life movement will continue to have some electoral potency. So I don't think that it's completely taken the wind out of the sails. I think that it's still going to be a force in politics. And thank God for that. Like, I remember growing up, I grew up in very kind of conservative Christian circles, and there were always kind of the one issue voters who voted solely on the pro-life issue, and then there were kind of the nuanced people, right? And as I went through college, the whole idea of the nuanced people finally reached its apex in 2016, where you just voted for Hillary Clinton and then voted for Joe Biden in 2020, and now you just vote for Democrats. Like, that's where nuance has ended you up. Now you vote for Democrats who, and especially our current one, who carries a rosary in his pocket, but has been, systematically bullied over the course of his 50 years in politics from actually being pro-life at the very beginning. And like 2 years after he was elected to the Senate, he gave an interview where he said he was pro-life and that he thought Roe v. Wade was wrong. And now he's essentially adopted the extremist position. And these are people whose love of nuance and allergy to being viewed as those kinds of ignorant Christian conservatives who just vote on one issue. Like, that's where it's led them. That's where it's ended them up. Where you just vote. You've gone from voting straight one ticket to straight the other ticket in exchange for the occasional little head pat.
Yeah, no, and I do think that after I had saw some articles talking about the sort of Mitch McConnell and others, and this is where I get a little nervous when Mitch McConnell says something that I agree with. is that he was talking about something in regards to like taking action at the federal level to sort of codify the overturn of Roe v. Wade. And I do think that that might be the way that this kind of goes forward on this issue, because this is the one thing that the right really does have an organized, well-funded cadre of people to take action. Because, I mean, it's not just, there's the religious aspect to it. I mean, almost every church in America outside of like really progressive, Unitarian types or... I mean, that's something where you can get virtually all high and low church Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox priests together being like, yeah, we reject this. But also, like, the funding wing of the Republican Party is motivated on this issue. It would be interesting to see that, you're going to have to put yourself on the line, federally speaking. Like, you'd have to formalize, I guess, the regime saying, like, yeah, we're good with pro-baby murder all the way up to, 40 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is like earlier this week, I lost it on Twitter where James Lindsay tweeted something about how like he tweeted one of those like distracted boyfriend memes.
Yeah.
I guess we're still doing those. If you're James Lindsay, where it was like the hot girl distracting the guy was like Roe v. Wade, and then all the other issues were like CRT and like immigration and all this other stuff. And I'm like, first of all, what are you even talking about? Like most people I know who are pro-life are also agree with you on these other issues. And like, this is just how the news cycle works. Like, are we not allowed to celebrate for 3 days that we got a huge win that we've been going for 50 years? And like, oh my gosh, I can't stand James Lindsay. Like,
well,
he ended up blocking me.
I've been blocked by him for months. Yeah,
just like of all the like, I don't know, is he in the intellectual dark web? Does that still exist? Or like the anti-woke? He's just the most useless figure to me in the anti-woke space. Like, I just have no use for him at all.
Well, he wants to go back to calling everything cultural Marxism, but I mean, this is the problem that you see when sort of any sort of like you mentioned, like a nuanced liberal. And what makes it worse is that James Lindsay is like a devout new atheist from the mid 2000s. And so there's a fundamental issue that gets like religious, motivation to get things like excited for a victory. And, he's got to punch right. He already had fought with sort of the online right earlier this year where he was talking about what the West is. And, everyone with like a cross in their Twitter profile was just like, you're forgetting like Christianity. And he's just like,
and there was that weird episode too where he was trying to like lecture churches about like how like woke churches are interpreting the gospel wrong or something, and everyone was like just
yeah. James, renowned theologian, James Lindsay.
Well, Aaron McIntyre, I thought this was really astute, like predicted like right after the decision leaked, said a lot of the a lot of the kind of secular modernity types who have drifted to the right due to their anti-woke stances are going to drift back to the left over this. They're gonna go back and say, hey, sorry, we screwed up. Like, we didn't realize we were signing on with a bunch of religious fanatics or whatever. And I think you are going to see that happening. I think you're already seeing that happening to some degree. So I haven't seen one figure that I think of with that description is Dave Rubin, who I haven't actually seen do that yet. So far, what I've seen from him is him saying like, look, this is good. It lets the states decide type thing. Because I know he's still like pro-choice-ish.
Well, I think that he's okay with the pro-life movement. I'm not going to go there. I just
I think he's like I think he's like been drawn into the right enough that at this point he can't afford to try to cut ties. Whereas there's some people who have, I think, stayed aloof enough that they can.
Sure, but I mean, it's also a great way, I think, and this is something where as an outsider looking in, maybe it's just I get frustrated because it's just basically, he's in the right in the way that like the right kind of just is what Democrats were maybe 30 years ago in the 90s, where it's just like I get concerned when like prominent quote unquote conservative personalities are congratulating him for making the announcement he's going to be adopting children. That rubs me the wrong way, but that unfortunately is how the ratchet turns.
Yeah. I mean, which if you want to bring this around to the
Yeah.
Vanity Fair article that we were that we were talking about, that was kind of the weird thing about like the National Conservatism Conference. Like I watched most of the talks from that, and I kind of walked away from it being like, what is this?
Yeah,
Like
no,
you're
it threw me off too because you had people ranging from like more of the traditional neoconservative crowd or the more socially, like Dave Rubin had spoken, and then they had one not too long ago, right, overseas, where like you had
yeah,
people like Alex Kashuta talking,
yeah,
and that's what I loved about the Vanity Fair article. Like after like finally reading it through, and I tweeted, I was like, oh, like all my mutuals are on this.
yeah.
Like, it's either 1 degree or I've talked to these people one on one. In regards to who was mentioned, and the fact that you said it right, like where is this thing going, where is it all over the place? The article itself, you had everything from like the Fed Post, which is like three
Mhm.
guys with really strong Marxist leanings, to like Red Scare, to Curtis Yarvin, to Blake Masters. It's just all over the place. There's not a cohesive identity, I think.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting time to be alive, right? Like you said, you had like Dave Rubin, you had Ayaan Hirsi Ali. So you just had people who like I got the sense that kind of the animating force to it was just that they didn't like wokeness. Like the most criticism I heard of anything was probably CRT. Which like I'm all for fighting back against CRT. Like I think it's crazy, but that's not like my issue, like I'd say my issues if I had to put my finger on like two, specifically cultural issues. For me, that's abortion and transgenderism. Like it just easy. Now obviously like there's the economic side of things, which is not separable from the cultural side of things and is incredibly important. I kind of in college and after I was sort of coming through the kind of libertarian Coke pipeline that had been set up, and I absorbed a lot of Coke money that did not have any effect on my ideology except to push it in the opposite direction. But when I was like hearing these, when I would be going to these talks and stuff from these Coke sphere people, I just kept hearing over and over again all this stuff about how like, oh yeah, we you can't interfere with the free market, you can't do this, and I would just say, okay, like I understand what you're saying, and like I'm not an economist, but I would love for the response when I say like, hey, the small Western Pennsylvania town I grew up in is filled with the husks of empty steel mills where you used to be able to work for a good union wage, and if you were a single man, you could, you know, spend 4 nights a week at the bar chasing tail and like drive a nice car and like have a house and pursue a hobby that you liked in your spare time. And if you were married, like you could be the sole breadwinner for your family. um where like the town was full of jobs like that, and now all the mills are closed, those jobs don't exist anymore, the population's dropped by half, the median income is half the state average, and people are dying of heroin overdoses. Like, yeah, I probably don't have all the charts here to argue with you because, again, I'm not an economist, but I would love for the response when I say, like, hey, the people I grew up around are dying, for your response not to just be like, ah, that's socialism, Like,
Yeah. And I mean, it kind of reminds me because, like, before, like, the 2016 election, when Bernie Sanders decided to throw his hat in the ring, when the conversation of open borders came up, Bernie Sanders was just like, oh, you mean like that Koch brothers thing where they just want to, like, flood
yeah,
it with, cheap labor and depress the American wage? Like, there was this genuine pro worker, sort of pro American response. I mean, it had the echoes to, like, what Ross Perot had said with NAFTA, that giant sucking sound. And I mean, today, like in my political sort of come up and about, like I remember in high school, because like I went to high school in El Paso at the time, they had like immigration activists come and speak in the auditorium about DACA, and like basically how prosecutorial discretion from the chief executive, like it was just the mental gymnastics for how DACA could work. And then he started listing out the numbers, and I'm just sitting there like on my phone, like doing the math. I'm like, this applies to a very niche number of people. But I mean, it's about the messaging. And that's the other thing is that really there has been this reaction to a lot of it where now people are routinely aware. I think the Vanity Fair piece sort of highlights a lot of maybe the last 8 or so years since really 2012, which a lot of people call like the Great Awakening, where things are kind of coming to a head, maybe in terms of organization or rhetoric. I mean, there's no way 5 years ago you would have gotten Charlie Kirk to say that there's a war on white people. Yeah, I mean, that would have been something Nick Fuentes and his like Groyper crowd would have gone to like Turning Point USA conferences and colleges and asked that question to be promptly escorted out of the auditorium. So I do think that you're certainly seeing something change, and there's sort of this. And it's funny that the article, and I'll share it on screen now. Add the stream. Here we go. You know, the new right, which is always, I suppose that's probably the better term, because, you know, Paul Gottfried, who's still with us, you know, he had said back in the 90s that there needs to be like a need for an alternative. And then that term got coined
and alt-right, if you will.
Yeah, an alt-right, if you will. Which, you know, then
means nothing anymore.
Which means nothing really, exactly, right? But if you were to talk to someone like Murray Rothbard when he was still alive, he was just so excited because he's talking about the Pat Buchanan campaign back in when he had first made his real run in the 90s, where he was just like, the old right is back, like this new, and he called the Buckleyite neoconservatism of the time the new right. So, you know, time, you know, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure rhymes. But yeah, I mean, here's where we're at.
Yeah. The article was so interesting to me because there are kind of a few, there are like a few aspects of it that it gives you a lot of different angles, and I've touched on maybe a few of them. I don't know. I don't really listen to a lot of the podcasts they mentioned. In terms of the Twitter sphere they talk about, I'm like, you know, like you said, like all my mutuals are here. Like I'm sort of, you know, somewhat plugged into that. The whole like Manhattan, you know, new right scene part to me was so strange. I don't know. Maybe it's just because I'm like a small town guy, and I've lived in DC for 6 years, so I'm used to living in a city now. But even living in a city, New York is still just overwhelming to me whenever I visit there.
Well, I wonder if that's in reference to the New York Young Republicans Club, because like what Gavin Wax and Vishbura have done has really turned that into something that's got a lot of energy. I know that they had their like conference earlier this year, and I think Vishbura, I think he's like the chairman, or he's in some leadership position, but he goes up there and he gives this full throated, like yelling at the top of his lungs, "We will not eat the bugs. We will not live in the pod. Like we reject all of this crap." And I'm like, this reads like a Twitter post that I would find somewhere in the various spheres that I'm friendly with, which I just thought was like, that's interesting. But yeah, the Manhattan thing threw me off, because it's just like, I don't ever really associate New York with a prominent conservative thing. I mean, I know Buckby had ran for office back then, but I mean, that was 1960s in New York. It's vastly different to what it is today.
I mean, there's also just such a like, that in that side of it, there's such like an art scene, like hip aspect to it that I don't know. People like that have always just intimidated me or thrown me off balance a little bit. I don't know, somebody like Default Friend, who I like, and, you know, we'll like text sometimes, but I don't know. She just seems to inhabit this like artsy sphere of existence that I just like can kind of flutter around the outside of, but
yeah, no, I like her sphere and I like her writing, because I actually picked up a physical copy of the American Affairs Journal because I saw her name on the cover.
Oh, wow.
She was reviewing Jonathan Franzen's Crossroads, and she asked this really interesting question that she didn't get a chance to really answer to in the review, but I was like, I got to write about that. That was really good. But like, she gets mentioned, well, she doesn't get mentioned, but like her associates with like Anna and such from like the Red Scare podcast. But I mean, even here on the article, I've got this little, you know, piece here about, you know, young and well-educated elite, this intermedia class info war, you know, podcasters, bro-ish, anonymous Twitter posters, online philosophers, artists, just all these sort of different pieces of everything that is just loosely associated, where, you know, Marxist cultural critics. I mean, I've heard Curtis Wright Mills get cited in a lot of like right-wing circles now, where he's talking about the ruling elite. And I'm like, see, Wright Mills was like a Marxist. Yeah. And to now where, you know, even here it's got the Ted Kaczynski wink and a nod with some affectionate, a semi-ironic affection as Uncle Ted, which I know I've done on occasion.
One thing I think that's been a really interesting barometer for this is kind of the rehabilitation of Alex Jones, because kind of when I came to political consciousness, I guess, and I like first knew about Alex Jones. I mean, I guess he's been around a while. Obviously, there was that like viral clip of like young hot Alex Jones, right?
Yeah.
But there's, I don't know, my sense of Alex Jones was like, oh, here's this guy who's genuinely insane and, means every word he says, and the people who listen to him are like also genuinely insane. And I think that there's this aspect to the new right of, there's a lot of irony. There's a lot about it that's performative. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Like, because when you speak in a way that's considered kind of straightforward according to like the accepted norms that we have, right? You're sort of giving the game away. Like you're automatically playing by the rules of the regime, if I'm going to use that term, right? So I don't know. I mean, like it's been quite a while. I think it's been like over a year at this point. But I used to be a pretty big stoner when I first moved to DC, and I can remember sitting on the couch with my friend, smoking weed, and we were just like watching Alex Jones clips. And at one point, I was like, like he's throwing a ton of spaghetti at the wall, and like 90% of it doesn't stick, but like there's some gems in here. There's some stuff he says that hits something on a larger level. There's that like famous rant he did where he's like, they want your kids talking about Justin Bieber instead of idolizing Magellan, who sailed his fleet the whole way around the world. That's willpower. That's being an explorer. Kids, Magellan's a lot cooler than Justin Bieber. Like, he's like, but this is what they want. They want your kids learning about Justin Bieber. And I was like, yeah, no notes. Like, you nailed it, dude.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely seen a rehabilitation since, the Sandy Hook thing. I mean, You can't go on Twitter without occasionally seeing some ominous news headline without the, obligatory another coin in the bucket for the Alex Jones was right jar. But I think that you...
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Oh, what I was going to say...
on mainstream in a lot of ways, like... I don't know. I kind of joked that like when JD Vance, who like, round of applause for the man, like good for him winning that primary, like awesome. I'm very happy about that. But like early on in his campaign, I would joke to people that like his policy proposals were like performance art, like when he got up and said at that ISI conference that he wants to give parents extra votes for every child they have under 18. Like it was just so out of left field and something that no traditional politician would ever propose. But like it had the desired effect, which was to shake up the conversation and think like, okay, do we want to build a society that's built around the needs and desires of deracinated millennial dog parents, or do we want to build a society that's for families?
Yeah, no, and it reminded me when he had mentioned that, I was like, this is sort of the right-wing answer to something I remember reading in the Washington Post in like the 2012 election, where they were like, you really want like voter justice, and they were talking about like give African Americans 5/3 the vote. Yeah. And I was like, oh, okay, that'll shake up the conversation, but I mean that's sort of the direction that things were going. And I think that it was interesting to see the parallel here, because like the other like podcasters that get mentioned, like the Good Old Boys or the Fed Post, two radically different sides of the coin, sort of addressing some of the structural and cultural issues of the day. Like I've been on the Fed Post twice, and like the last time we talked about was this issue of like antinatalism. Like there's so much about dog parents or calling your children fur babies or whatever, and that it sort of illustrates that the material conditions along with the culture, I mean, they both work hand in hand. It has really made this incentive that, the powers that be don't want you to have kids. And like you had mentioned, those small towns are nothing more than husks for heroin overdoses, and the steel mills are closed. it always makes me laugh. I think it's a Lemmy joke from the UK where he's on like some sort of panelist show and he just jokingly says, like, we used to make steel. And I think that that's very relevant to the US as well. And I mean, that's the problem, is how do you shake up that culture? And you have to do it, I think, by some degree by changing the conversation, because you mentioned irony earlier. And I think that one good thing about irony is that, with any bit of irony, right, or anything that's said jokingly, you say it enough times, people will start taking you seriously, which is how certain Mongolian basket weaving forums get ruined. But neither here nor there. Like Oren McIntyre's like the perfect example of this, where he'll take like the "don't make me tap the sign" or the it's not rocket science, they're just coming to diddle your kids. Like, I mean, you say that enough times and people will buy into it, and it works in a way that's very mimetic. I mean, it's a mind virus to take a line from Dawkins, and now more recently Curtis Yarvin, I guess, to circle back to the article.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's that there's that famous Twitter thread that people keep trying to pull out as like some kind of gotcha, as if he didn't like tweet it on his own account, where Chris Rufo was like, yes, we are actively attempting to like reclassify all the things we don't like under the label of CRT, and then make that term political poison. And they're like, oh, see, this guy's like, a grifter or whatever. It's like, he told you what he was doing. Like, it's that's just a good strategy, and it's working exactly. And I think it's good to shake up things. I think it's good to change the conversation here, because the conversation you're having, I think, leads you to what I said. You nuance yourself to death, right? And I know this because it almost happened to me. Thankfully, like, events in my life conspired such that I was pulled back from the abyss. But if you play by the rules, which is like, okay, we have a certain set of norms and we all play by these norms, and there's certain things that are allowed, certain things that aren't allowed, a certain tone that's expected, and if you don't stick to that tone, you're not part of the club type thing. And I've just found that people who accept all of those parameters at face value tend to end up in the same place. In terms of their voting behavior, in terms of their ideology, in terms of their the things they're willing to say, the people they're willing to associate with. And after a while, it's like, well, when you play within these parameters, why do you always end up over here? And it's like, well, maybe the game board's tilted a little bit, right?
Well, yeah, and this is the thing that the article kind of alludes to, that it doesn't make explicit reference to, but you talk to enough people, you kind of get the understanding that feedback gets appreciated. The article does highlight, right, like there's some substantial organization, or at least that there is a club that wants to talk about other things. Like if Blake Masters, like in the article, is like winking and nodding and making reference to, rage, retire all government employees, which you can find from like a Yarvin talk from like a little like over 10 years ago. Then I mean, there's some clear, both ideological but also some like powerful funding here, where it mentions Thiel and the money, and the ThielBux meme gets referenced, which I thought was great, because for the record, to the chat, I'm not getting any ThielBux. If that were the case, I could afford a house.
I'm not getting any either. If anyone knows where I can get some, let me know.
Yeah, I mean,
I've run out of Coke dollars. I need some ThielBux.
We'd like that, but no. But it does show that there's this communication, and it kind of does reveal a lot of what people's gut feelings were. I mean, when Chris Rufo got started, he was like, we're going to change the laws. We're going to start making, these bans on CRT, this sort of all-encompassing term. And we're going to press forward on that. And I mean, immediately, like as soon as he starts to get notoriety in Flack, Curtis writes this piece about, changing the laws is great, but it doesn't matter unless you get rid of unless you have either A, control of the institution, or B, the institution is just destroyed. Yeah. So, and I think Rufo has taken some of that to heart when it comes to not only just electoral politics, but what certain affiliates can and can't do. And I think that is a good thing. I mean, people give a lot, especially online in sort of the sphere of the right, I guess, a lot of flack that Rufo isn't very adamant about saying that, He doesn't say anti-white. And I think that he probably does that for strategic purposes, because it is he's playing within the game. He's playing the elections, and he's playing with the demographics that are available to him. So I mean, I don't blame him entirely, but I know that there's definitely communication since that article dropped, because I think Rufo's rhetoric has definitely changed a little to focus on, it's not just CRT, but it's it's the teachers, it's the teachers unions. Yeah. He's hitting all the big names and institutions.
Yeah, well, and I mean that's where like Libs of TikTok's been incredibly useful, is just really bringing home the like visceral reality of like, oh my gosh, these like, purple haired, people with septum piercings are telling my kids all about how they're pansexual. And it's horrifying, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, and they're like, oh, well, clearly this account has been like sponsored, or it has. I'm like, well, it works. For once, there's some like actual, and this is where I think that the current political moment to me is sort of like the validation of what every satanic panic Christian mom from the 1980s was worried about. Like, this is the vindication of everything that they had been worried about, because the slippery slope is not just it's not a fallacy. Like, we clearly have seen that this is true. I mean, that was one of the earliest things I ever talked about, started to make videos and write essays, was just like, there were justices that were opposed and raised objections and concerns during Griswold v. Connecticut, that this logic about this invented right to privacy through the 14th Amendment could be used to guarantee abortion. Yeah. And the other justices were like, no, don't worry about that. That's impossible. And then, like, in a span of 10 years, from like 1963 to 1973, the same logic is used. And I mean, we're at the same point now where, and this is where the good old boys has talked about, they've referenced Richard Hanania, they've referenced Christopher Caldwell, where it's just like, yeah, this CRA, the Civil Rights, Amendment regime, like everything that they want to do, the Civil Rights Act, this disparate impact, this 14th Amendment due process clause has gotten you virtually everything that the left has wanted. Like, you live under a second constitution. And this is where I think the Yarvin bit about the two-story state, this clear pill series of essays he's never finished and probably never will. Yeah. But
well, that was a fascinating thing I took away from what I've seen and read of Yarvin is the idea of, like France is like called the French Fifth Republic, like, and we have this idea that we're still on the first one, and we're probably on about the fourth, right? Like, you had the Articles of Confederation regime, then you had the original Constitution, then you had Lincoln, and then you had FDR. Like, and you could potentially talk about the Civil Rights Act, I guess, too, which was a huge changeover too. I'd probably tend to place it between, I think the New Deal and kind of the new interpretation of Plessy v. Ferguson and all that probably are kind of the changeover point, just that it took that long to change over. But I don't know, I'm not an expert on this, but it was just an interesting concept to think like, yeah, this isn't just a static thing, right? Like this is a country like every other country. It's not just, oh, this is the way things are, right? And I think that's what really goes to the heart of the new right movement, is it's just this willingness to question the way things are, to say like, oh, well, maybe the game we've been playing for all these decades and decades is rigged, and maybe we need to start asking questions that aren't within the rules of that game. And I don't think that necessarily means you have to like outright embrace Caesarism or something like that, or like call for the total overthrow of the system we have. It's just because the system and the rules of the game are not synonymous. At least the system as it exists on paper, right? There's the written constitution and the unwritten constitution. There's the the unwritten constitution has changed a lot, even when the written one did not. And if you're questioning the unwritten one, you're I guess what I'm saying is like the people who are overtly questioning like the entire basis of the regime and want an American Caesar or a CEO state or whatever it is, and the people who have more faith in electoral politics but are willing to question the kind of unwritten norms that appear to be rigged in a certain way, like it seems natural to me that those people are on the same side, and I think that's what you're seeing in the New Right article.
Yeah, and I mean to take a line from that article, they mentioned everybody, right, from Chris Narde to Sorhab Armani to Michael Anton. But the quote I think that came there about the new magazine Compact, whose vision, according to its mission statement, shaped by our desire for a strong social democratic state that defends community, local and national, familial and religious, against a libertine left and a libertarian right.
Yeah,
It is
music to my ears. That's
yeah,
great.
it's a very of the moment project, as the article says.
Yeah,
and, I'm inclined to agree with that, just because, I mean, the libertarian right, for I think everyone kind of starts there when they grow up, or like as an adolescent. Like I was definitely in sort of the Ayn Rand, Ron Paul, Rand Paul sort of revolutionary type style of politics. And I mean, it's nice when you want to say that you want to be left alone, but as you'll hear, like, I think that it was like Lucha Cacciatore or someone who had tweeted that like every dissident Twitter account is just like, they hate you, they want you dead, and it's just like, well, yeah, we say these things because it looks like it's true. And I think that the libertarian right problem that it has is that it wants to play the electoral game, and so like now the official Libertarian Party is just basically disaffected Bernie bros and what Murray Rothbard called modal libertarians, where it's just like, I hate my dad, I hate going to church, I want to just smoke pot and like sleep with Art Ho GF and not worry about anything. And for us, it's just like, well, yeah, as nice as it would be to be left alone, you can only do that in a high trust society where you know your neighbor and you can break bread with them, but your government doesn't want to airdrop.
Oh no, I think you've frozen.
To change your voting patterns.
Yeah, well, I think that that's an interesting point, because for a long time, kind of the last stand of my libertarian impulses was this idea of this very communitarian idea where it's like, okay, the kind of extreme version of the Benedict option where it's just circle the wagons and prepare, settle in for the dark age, right? And try your best to build community where you are. And yes, like you said, ideally I would love to live in a high trust society with really strong social institutions where government's not particularly intrusive on my life. But unfortunately, that's not the society we live in. And the problem with trying to build these institutions and with trying to build community in order to weather the storm that's coming is that you are just hopelessly outgunned. You turn the TV on and leave the room for 5 seconds and they're telling your kid that there's 87 genders. Like, it's the deck is just so incredibly stacked. And that was really what the kind of thought that really was a pivot point for me, was just thinking, well, okay, it might all be well and good for me to circle the wagons, and maybe my wife and I'll be able to afford to send our children to a good classical school where they'll get a good education, and we won't give them smartphones until until they're like in college, hopefully. This is another joke I would always make when I was listening to libertarian people, and they were talking about the glories of innovation, is say oh great, the iPhone has 3 cameras and 25% of 11-year-olds are addicted to porn. Maybe in 10 years it'll have 8 cameras and 90% of 11-year-olds will be addicted to porn. But I was just thinking okay, that's me. I'm pretty well educated. I'm a pretty smart person, I think. On Twitter, it would depend who you asked, but
same here.
I kind of am aware of these threats, but if I'm going to say okay, that's what we need to do, then how much suffering am I calling down on the people who are just going to kind of go with the flow, just kind of normal people, in the small towns that in the small town that I grew up in, right? These people aren't going to go get 2 expensive liberal arts degrees and be aware of all these cultural trends and dangers. and they shouldn't have to. They should live in a society that has their best interests at heart. That's not, using limbic capitalism and just this addictive technology designed by the most brilliant people in the world to turn them into just drooling zombies and force them into the pod and to eat the bugs, right?
Well, yeah, and I just, you see how, and this is where I think it's sort of this like sort of wake up moment where, in the running in the back of my head is always the fear is, the frog is kind of aware that the pot is boiling, but does it have the strength now to get out, or has it been too boiled?
Yeah,
because I had a conversation with Oren McIntyre not too long ago, and he had sort of mentioned that like, it was either Oren or someone where we sort of like, well, the left has kind of really been the true inheritors of Carl Schmitt's friend enemy distinction, because like we're the enemy to them. We've been getting beaten over the head, for decades. And we've had this sort of placated, managed, just go with the flow type deal. And it's really frustrating for me because I do live in one of those small towns. And like every Monday I go on this drive with my job to go pick up things. And it's always through rural communities. And you can just see them like bitterly clinging to these like, let's go Brandon flags or Trump 2024, please save this country. I had a guy who was like a really well-dressed man panhandling. He wasn't asking for money. He just had this little sign that said FJB and like initials, because obviously F Joe Biden. And it's just like, I feel so angry just because it's just like these people want some sort of political solution. They want things to just not destroy them internally and hollow them out from within. But it's just like, but the people that, we've watched for so long, they're, I mean, it's not like almost every person in Congress is a millionaire. Like, Nancy Pelosi's worth millions of dollars. So is Mitch McConnell. Like, let's not kid ourselves here. But, there's still this hope for this sort of populist uprising. And my position has always been that like 2016 was sort of the wake up call to the establishment that their thumb wasn't on the scale as much as it needed to be.
Yeah.
Because like Hillary Clinton before that election was just like, I have an army of lawyers. I'm going to do everything it takes to make sure that like the vote is properly counted in like Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio. And like come the election, she doesn't do that. Right. And, that happened. And here we are, right? Like the real blockout has already occurred, but I don't think that'll happen again. But you see these like three sort of camps right now, I think, in sort of like right-wing politics. And I think that this new right, or what Charlemagne has called sort of the neo-reactionary right in this official form, since Yarbin and Thiel are in on it, is that you have like the traditional, standard of the line, GOP, love me guns, love me Republican Party sort of deal. The American North FC meme. You have your populists, which are really now with a bunch of younger guys that are trying to break out and play into the game. They're working with trying to retake the Libertarian Party, whether they're Hoppians and Rothbard types. There's like the American Populist Union, which is like this Zoomer political movement working with like Newsmax guys. And then all of a sudden we have this, which is sort of this deep pocket Thiel money interests. And where even they themselves don't agree on everything, because you can talk about social issues and it's like, they mentioned like the Red Scare podcast. And like the one thing that I remember like Anna talking about from her is that I think she always has this line about like polycules and polyamory. It's just like, it's not sexual liberation. It's not sexual anarchy. You're becoming a sexual bureaucrat.
Sexual bureaucracy.
You have to play into the, everyone has to have the same personality and it all just kind of bleeds through together. But I mean, it's not like I could just have like, it's not like you could have that put into a conversation where it's like, that therefore we should really just return to like traditional, like good old fashioned Christian values about family. So there's always, it's very disparate in the ideas where Tucker Carlson can be, joking about an Oren McIntyre tweet and then read like a class reductionists, like, tweet thread talking about like the pandemic. Like, it does say quite a bit.
Yeah. And I think that the reason, because this is so in flux right now, and because you have all these different strands, I think there's a lot of different directions it could go. People throw around the term like right Leninism, which always makes me laugh. But I don't think it's a bad term, this call for like an intellectual vanguard to kind of shape the movement in a certain way.
Well, I know that like Dr. Samantra Mitra, who works, I think, with like the Royal Historical Society, he talks about international relations. That's his field of study, and he's talked about like a reactionary Leninist type deal. Mary Harrington likes to point that out as well. But I mean, you go back even in the UK, back when like the British National Party was still a thing. I know that before Jonathan Bowden died, he called for a vanguard. Like, I think that that's the direction that you're seeing going here. Is that for better or for worse, like Curtis Yarvin, like other articles have talked about, like his political ideas are here to stay. There are plenty of things that we can sort of criticize. There are other neo-reactionary writers that have called him out. I know Nick Land has taken some issue with him, saying that he's kind of drifted away from his like Austro-libertarian roots. But I mean, if you're going to have an intellectual vanguard, it's interesting because his viewpoint is that he's like this Coriolanus type figure where he doesn't really agree with, like people that grew up in small town, rural America or, the Rust Belt, but he sympathizes with them. And that's sort of been the discussion that has been, at least on this side, right? That you want to find disaffected elites or those that might be potential that have money and capital to like maybe change things. The debate I've really been watching from what I guess you could call this new right crowd has been, well, what does that look like? I mean, Yarvin has talked about monarchy with this sort of corporate CEO king, which I think deserves proper interrogation, because I think the whole Twitter thing with Musk kind of brings that into question about, well, how good is a CEO king if it's beholden to the board, but the board doesn't have, the same ideologies in mind.
Like he talks about like Pompey like clearing the Mediterranean of pirates, and like that was showing how like the late Roman Republic had like become sclerotic and like lost its state capacity, and how like by analogy, I don't know, like Elon Musk could like buy the DC Metro and like fix it or something, and just like show that yes, I can do this more efficiently than you. Like you've lost your efficiency, you've lost your state capacity and lost your mandate to govern or whatever. But like, it is important to note that, just several waves of civil war followed that. And I would very much like to avoid that.
Well, that's sort of like the weird precipice that we're on, because there are a lot of like both in, people who are, do the talks, do the journalism thing, but also have their own thing online, have had that debate about national divorce. I know Michael Anton has talked about it. I know Scott Greer has talked about it. And I mean, there's this debate over like, okay, we can identify some of these issues where, like, do we want Caesarism? Do we want to return to the spirit of 1789? And there's just these conflicting, interpretations of what's to come.
Yeah, and this is one thing that I do get prickly online sometimes at people who are just like gleefully like, yes, overthrow the regime type thing. And I just like, you realize the game that you're asking to play right now, and it's not a good game. Like it's almost always a bad game for almost everyone involved. And maybe at the end you end up at a place that might be better than where you started, but with a lot of bad stuff along the way. So, when I come to the conclusion that like, the culture is very far gone, and the, especially some of the most degenerate aspects of our culture are. Can I have some wine? My wife brought me water. I like just did a drink motion, and she got like.
Well, there you go.
I was insufficiently clear, but that's all right. So like when I came to the conclusion that like yes, like all of this stuff is being pushed coercively by the culture and the state, and in a way that leaves people who don't want their children absorbing that hopelessly outgunned, for the most part. So like. The state has to play some role in pushing back against this. Just thinking, I mean, like how many, like, I suppose you could argue that like, doing heroin is a personal failing, but at the same time, like how many families wouldn't have had to bury their kids if the government would do its damn job at the border? How many kids would not have had their lives torn apart by divorce if we would just like tighten up divorce laws a little bit?
Well, and that's the thing that I've really seen come out of this, because I don't.
How many kids are like, to go to like the Florida law, like how many kids would not have mutilated and sterilized themselves if they weren't being brainwashed in schools?
Well, no, exactly, because like what was the reaction to this law? One, it's watered down to all capacity. I mean, they got so upset because there was the slightest pushback about, oh, you have to wait till fourth grade, right? Until they're like, what, 9, 10 years old to not talk about degeneracy. And at the same time, you know, he's actually using state power. And then all of a sudden, this is where all of the quote unquote small government types really just came out in full force, where they were just like, well, this isn't conservatism. We don't use the power of the state to punish our enemies. This is why. And I'm thinking to myself, you're just explaining to me in the back of my head why you guys have been losing for the last 60 years.
Socialism is when the government does things, right?
Yeah. So socialism is when government does something. Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, but like, to circle back to what I was saying, like, I will say that when I came to that conclusion that we need to use state power here, like, I wasn't happy about that. Like, you know, it was energizing in a way, but at the same time, it was frightening, because it's like, yes, when you wield state power in this way, like, you are running a risk. Like, you know, and I think that a lot of people on the left and the right are pretty much in agreement about what time it is in this country. You know, I don't think either side is going to accept an election loss ever again.
Yeah, no. And I mean, this is the thing that has been interesting to me, is because if you were to ask like 2014 me, this like really excited, gung-ho, happy to vote in his first election type deal. Yeah, I'm aging myself there. But like, you know, I got involved. I was like an election judge. I was like really excited to like, I had this like really American idealized, like, this is democracy, this is how the system works. And then you work the system, and then you realize about voting machines and how it all works, and taking all of the machines to the city and taking the results to the city, making sure everything is secured. And you're like, oh, this is not a pretty good system to begin with. But then secondly, I mean, after 2020, regardless of whatever your perspective or take is, both you or the audience, it's just like, there's no way that the trust in that system ever gets redeemed at all. And I just wonder how much that's going to be the case come that, I mean, you know, election Twitter is its own thing, and they get really excited about taking action and telling you that there's going to be a red wave. But it's just like, how do you tell people to play the game?
Yeah, there was that whole segment on some cable news show where one of the guests was like, do you realize what Elon Musk taking control could mean? Like, he could censor news stories that were unflattering to the candidate he liked, and he could kick off the other candidates from the platform entirely. Like, and I was like, oh my God, what a crazy what a crazy hypothetical.
I know, what a strange counterfactual that you're proposing there. Not like that's ever happened before. But I mean, at this point, I just consider all of those kind of like hysterical rants, and they're just projection. They know exactly what they do and what they are. They're mouthpieces. I mean, you go back to like conservative era Twitter with Barack Obama, where it was just like, oh, like Ben Rhodes has got connections because he's got family at CNN, and it's just like all the maps. It's a very incestuous relationship, and it's like that never went away. Like, that's always been the case. Like, we can go back to even FDR and his relationship to the press. I mean, let's just save ourselves the mandatory reading of like Walter Lippmann and Edward Bernays, because those guys got it right. Like, consent can be manufactured, and public relations is key to sort of controlling things. And
one thing I'm annoyed that we were robbed of was like good like presidential pictures of Obama smoking cigarettes. Like, he smoked cigs the whole time he was president, and like the White House photographer just like by arrangement didn't take pictures of him smoking cigs. There's like a few candid shots of him, but like, I would just love like, you know, good high quality like professional photos of Obama just like smoking a cigarette, you know.
Oh, well, there's the return to tradition that we all want.
Exactly.
Smoking presidents.
There was for the Spectator world that I write for, I forget who did this essay, but like they wrote about how like, you know, the kind of Zoomer, the kind of like millennial way of getting into like a creative flow state where it's all, you know, like detoxes and ayahuasca and meditation and all this other stuff is like incredibly decadent. And we need to just return, spelled with a V, to like smoking 60 cigarettes a day. It's like if Jack Dorsey like smoked 60 cigarettes a day instead of like doing weird transcendental meditation, we'd be in a much better place.
Yeah, if only Silicon Valley would go back to American spirits and not microdosing on LSD. But I mean that was something that I noticed in the New York Times or the Vanity Fair piece was this. They were talking about like the artsy types, the sort of you know cultural artiste characteristics about. And I mean, let's not kid ourselves. There's been meme magic is still around, and this is the other article that came to mind was like Michelle Goldberg for the New York Times had talked about the dangerous advent of reactionary chic, and you know she's talking about like dark MAGA and everything like that, which you know I kind of scoffed at when it first started coming around. Dark MAGA, it's like, oh yeah, we're gonna learn our lesson next time with Trump, and this new right wing is not going to pull any punches. And I was just like, well, how much meme magic or like how much potential does like memes have compared to like the 2015, 2016 era of the good old days for memes? But I guess that it's worked to get the New York Times' attention.
I mean, I wrote an article that was like, you know, do we need to touch grass basically for the Spectator a little while ago, where I was like questioning like, yeah, when you're on Twitter, you know, and everybody follows the same people, and it's like, oh, there's so much energy here. Like there's so much ferment here. And I was like, is JD Vance just going to like come in 6th place in this primary? And we're all just going to be like, well, we had a good run, you know? But like he won, which, you know, shows me that we don't need to touch grass. Like, yeah, obviously these ideas are existing among and circulating largely among this vanguard, I guess. But like, yeah, clearly there is a way to make this palatable to, you know, senior citizens in Ohio, and great.
Yeah, no, and I mean, there's the running gag, right? That like every right wing group chat is just the same 20 people in like 8 different respective chats. Which I mean, if you're on Telegram, that's definitely sometimes the case. There's a lot of overlap, but I think that this is something I talked about earlier. I think this was on the discussion about authenticity and artificiality. This is just like we want to consider Twitter this like really like fake and gay space where it's just like it's the same like 8, you know, it's the same 20 accounts that are dunking on the same 20 blue check mark, you know, like Twitter news people. And it's just, but unfortunately, like what gets said on Twitter becomes the news chyrons of like that very night, or what happens the next day, or what the official policy is. And this is something that Default Friend has talked about, where it's just like, I think she did it for the clickbaity article, but she said Tumblr, you know, made your kids trans. And I was like, no, but she's right, because the people that made up all of this, you know, they misread, you know, Judith Butler or Kimberly Crenshaw, or deliberately took it to its logical conclusion. And the people that were talking about otherkin on Twitter, on Tumblr in 2012 are now writing the national gender strategy for equity.
Yeah, exactly. Like somebody, when there was like an NPR article that was this whole like deep dive into which like thumbs up emoji you should use, whether it's like too like white power you to use the white one, or whether it's like, you know, treating your own race as like the norm if you use the yellow one, and like obviously you can't use the black one because that's appropriate. Like, and so
digital blackface is a thing.
Yeah, somebody commented and was just like, I guess NPR is just publicly funded Tumblr now, you know?
Yeah, it has been for a while.
I did want to ask you,
sure,
just to do like a little Default Friends style internet archaeology, as amateurs here, of course, not a consummate professional like Catherine is, but so like she talks about how wokeness came from Tumblr, and you know, obviously, like with the Tea Party movement, that was kind of the last like big ferment on the right before MAGA and then the new right, which like time will tell how, you know, connected or disconnected those movements end up being seen as, I think. Like that could be an interesting thing to talk about later too. But like, you know, and then so like obviously the Tea Party was astroturfed by the Koch brothers, but like where did the new right come from? Like, is there an analogous statement you could make to what like Default says about like wokeness came from Tumblr, could you say in the same way like the new right came from 4chan? I don't know, because like
Oh, I mean,
there's enough of like a trad angle to it that I don't know if it came from.
I mean, that's a good question, actually, because I mean, like, 4chan has always been this like slash
I've
poll
never
has been
spent time on 4chan, so I'm like in the dark here.
well, to give it up, like I go there on occasion, and I think that you can. 4chan can sometimes give you takes on what's actually going on the ground before it hits the news. Like they did that with Jeffrey Epstein being suicided, right? But the zeitgeist around poll, for anyone who's been there long enough, and unfortunately I've been there way more than I'd like to admit, is that like the zeitgeist in say slash poll had this weird mix of like left libertarian, proto woke, Occupy Wall Street, but there was also this like libertarian right, and then this weird, like, of course, because it's 4chan, like the NatSoc element, right? And it evolved where now it's far more right wing than it was maybe 10 years ago. And I think that Trump and MAGA had a lot to do with that. But I do think that if you want an evolution to like, how did we get to here? All roads of online internet discourse at this point just kind of like find themselves straight back to Gamergate. I have no problem going that far, going back to make that claim, because it's just like you got your sort of libertarian skeptic community. The new atheism gave way to the skeptics gave way to making itself more adamantly political. So you have like the divergence of like, you have like the shoe on head goes to like the left, so sock dem type, and now Sargon of Akkad is like a Scruton-esque like conservative. Yeah. But I mean, from all of that, you start getting exposed, and because it is explicitly online, you start looking for things and you start reading things and you find people talking about it. I mean, even beforehand, Curtis Yarvin was writing about his stuff about Carlyle and Schmidt and everything back in like 2007, right? I mean, even before the last 2.0 Web 2.0 stuff about the blogosphere, before Twitter really takes off. And but I mean, for its proliferation, I really do think that, the Gamergate style politics, there are a lot of people my age and they're now mid to late 20s that are just like, yeah, like, the whole I just wanted to play video games meme, I think, is very real. Where my idea of
making me do this, I just wanted to grill,
well, exactly, right. And I think that's the case. Is that my politics probably would have stayed far more milquetoast right, libertarian, vote for the GOP every election, not really worry about anything. But then you just start finding out how incestuous the relationship with ethics and games journalism, it's this disgusting cesspool where people sleep with each other for good reviews. I bet it's like that with all other parts of government, and like it just kind of just spills out to what it is. But that's my perspective. It's limited by my age and my exposure online, but yeah, I do think that a lot of what we would call this new right it is organic in the sense that you find things on the internet and you want to talk about them. There's no way that if it weren't for that, I would be buying copies of the works of Joseph de Maistre or Robert Filmer's Patriarcha from Imperium Press. Like that would not have happened if I had like not checked out like what the heck is this Gamergate thing in like 2014.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Like, I just want to play. Yeah, there's like I just want to play video games, and there's like the remember you're the normal one thing. Like, you're just a normal person from 30 years ago type meme.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing I tell people in this sphere is it's just like I don't want you don't feel like things are overwhelming, right? Like there's no I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Like this thing, state of affairs, like the myth of progress has clearly been like debunked. Like things are not better than they were 30 years ago, but like, don't be distraught because, 30 years ago, 60 years ago, like, over the last 100 years, you would have been considered a very normal person. And I that's something I think people need to remind themselves is like, yeah, your opinions are called far right because the people you're dealing with are degenerates.
One thing, so you mentioned shoe on head, and I talked about like, the Ohio primary is like one barometer for whether this like new right thing's going to have any staying power.
Yeah.
My other barometer is Shoe on Head's current relationship.
I have no idea who she's seeing.
She's dating a guy named his name's Eudaimonia on Twitter. I don't know his real name. I'm supposed to talk to him in a couple weeks, actually, I think. But he's a Catholic convert. And just like very of the new right was like, you know, a huge JD Vance guy was like heckling Josh Mandel on Twitter for weeks. It's very funny. You know, he and Shu obviously very much have in common the like I won't live in the pot, I won't eat the bugs thing, but he's like, you know, devout Catholic, like very strongly pro-life, very conservative on you know, issues of like sexual morality and gender and stuff. And like they seem very happy together. So I'm like, I feel like their relationship is kind of a microcosm of like what the New Right coalition is trying to pull off. So if they can make this relationship work, I think we can all make this relationship work.
My position is that a lot of her politics or what she posts about, I think, has a correlation to whoever she's seeing at the time. I know that sounds terrible, but I think that there's some truth to that. Because I mean, like, she's also very Vosh-like, and I don't want any of that near what I would consider to be right wing. So like, please get that. But it's funny that you had mentioned the Catholic convert thing, because that's another thing that I think that this new right has
because you're a convert to Orthodoxy, right?
Yeah, I am. But I don't talk about it too much on the internet because like my journey back to Christianity and ending of where I am now has nothing to do with my online life, because it was just like I was on dialysis for a year. I just got a kidney transplant. A brush with your mortality is kind of going to bring you back to God. It had nothing to do with like finding. And I've ranted about this. You don't go to church because, oh, it's like this based right-wing thing. You go to church to engage in communion with God. Like, don't, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I listen to Lord of Spirits podcast. I don't know if you do. I really enjoy it. And it's like really clarified my thinking on a lot of issues. Like first, like primarily abortion, you know, because this is another example of like when you view things within like the barriers, the rules of the game, so to speak. It's like, oh, okay, well, like, you know, you can compromise in this way, and like what's the weak limit and what about the exceptions, and like da 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 da. But like that's if you're viewing it through the point of view of secular materialism. If you're viewing this through the point of view of a world that's not just purely material, then you see like, oh, this is child sacrifice to Moloch under a different guise. This is blood sacrifice to the god of the self. Then it becomes a lot clearer, and you feel, or at least I felt a lot more motivated to fight for it, you know.
Well, yeah, and that's something that I've kind of noticed with how disparate the sort of first principles are of these, you know, new right personalities or the neo-reactionary right or whatever, is because there's a lot of libertine materialist, like, you know, attitudes that are existing within it.
Well, that's the big threat to me, is like there's some low-hanging fruit in terms of like building a coalition on the right that can win elections, and that's the so-called like barstool conservatives.
Yeah, which I mean, the old phrase about, you know, from George Carlin, just, you know, like imagine how stupid the average person is and then double it. Like barstool conservatism.
What is it? It's imagine how stupid the average person is and then remember that like half of people are stupider than that.
Yeah, something like that. But like that's something that does bother me. It's just like you can't tell me that things are in decline and then not really address the greater issue of it. Like people.
Well, this is why we need this. This is like goes to the necessity for like a vanguard that we talked about, right? Is like because if you just want to focus on like giving people what they want to win elections, and you want to win the barstool types, then what you're going to do is go completely libertine on sexual morality, generally speaking. You know, put up a fight on CRT, put up a fight on you know, like grooming and stuff in the classroom, you know, and then otherwise just basically abandon social conservatism, like give up the abortion issue because the barstool conservatives don't care about that. You know, and in fact, like they're on the Democrats' side there because they want to use women for sex and then have them get abortions. Well,
no, and that goes back to something that and like I've had conversations with in the background about this article and just in general is that there is this sort of push, and this is to no disrespect to my Catholic friends, I have plenty, but there's been this like really weird push for this more like integralist right, you know, sort of the Adrian Vermeule and his sort of his circles. That I wonder if that scene sort of was that a flash in the pan, or Is there more to it? Because I mean, there are a lot of people that are sort of in this new right, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, they're like, even in the circles that I run with, you'll have Orthodox, Catholic, Lutheran, high and low church Protestants all talking about the issues. Like when you talk in real life and you meet with your friends and, you know, you discuss these issues and have meetings, it's just like, whoa, you know, like all of this, like we can have memes about our interdenominational spurgery any day of the week, but it's just like, come real life, like, you know, the bigger issue is like Satan. Like that's what we're up against, is the evil one. Like I think that we can put our petty theological or ecclesiastical differences aside for 2 minutes to deal with that issue. But the other problem is, though, is that you do have a lot of people that identify the structural stuff, and this is why the disparate thing is kind of worrisome, is that there are a lot of people that'll be like, oh yeah, like this, the fact that, you know, we've conditioned and created an economic structure through like the current elite, right, has created a sort of economic structure where you do need a 2 household income to like really raise kids, but then your kids go to government schools where they're going to get indoctrinated, and, you know, no amount of heart to heart, leave it to beaver dinner style conversations are going to save your children. Then like, yeah, it's really bad. And if that doesn't happen, then outright we're just telling women and also men to just like pursue your career, freeze your eggs, and go to like the high end bar every Friday and try and get laid while your neurochemistry is being rewired because birth control. And there are people that are like, oh yeah, that's really bad, but I want that for me, but not everybody else. And it's just, it's sort of, it's almost this like really ascetical hedonism where it's just like, well, we really should address these things. These are a problem, but I want it for me, you know?
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that is a risk here, where if you lean on the social conservative stuff, which again, I think is incredibly important to making people's lives better. You know, like ideally I want people in my town to have, you know, good paying union jobs that you can raise a family on. And like, I want them to have communities without fentanyl, and I want them to have a society in which, you know, the law recognizes staying married as the desirable norm. And like, I don't think that's crazy to go for, you know, but, and in which like, it is not allowed or available to kill your child in the womb. And that's, you know, I don't think those are unreasonable goals, but like, if that's your platform, like you're going to lose the barstool conservatives. Unfortunately, you're going to lose the bro conservatives who like are, you know, anti-woke and like making fun of people with blue hair. But at the end of the day, like, exactly, they want to go out to the bar and try and get laid, you know?
Yeah.
And like, I mean, you saw this, like the president of Barstool, what's that guy's name? I can't remember.
I don't know either. I don't particularly pay too much attention, but
he was doing like a podcast like the day that the decision leaked, and he was like, oh, if this is the issue, then I'm voting Democrat. And like, there were, you know, when he like, I mean, he for like a couple years, like within the last few years, he's been like going on Tucker Carlson and like was interviewed with, like did an interview with Ben Shapiro. And like, there was this sense of like, oh, this guy and like his people, like they're the future of like the rights winning coalition. And like, this was all it took, and it just went up in smoke, you know?
Yeah. And this is something that I find particularly interesting, is because these are, I think that the cultural issues, I think, are, at least locally, I don't have any confidence really in sort of nationwide races, but like locally, I mean, like Virginia was an example that like, I don't have any faith in Youngkin, but I mean, if it really takes social pressure and the cultural issues to start getting people fired up to care, then yeah, I mean, Nova will forever be blue, but it was not as blue as it was because like the whole Loudoun County thing. Like that's a good thing.
This is my. We can fix this. We can fix this because retroceding Alexandria to Virginia was patently unconstitutional.
Oh yes, your West Virginia bit. Yeah, no.
And apparently, I was supposed to write an article about like DC statehood when that was like in the news a year ago or whatever. And I did all this research and that was like the conclusion I came to. And a lot of other people have come to this conclusion apparently too, because I was like, I can't wait till Alexandria gives me a parking ticket. I'm going to take it to the Supreme Court and prove that they have no authority to enforce Virginia state law. And somebody like sent me a picture on Twitter of they have this notice posted in the like courthouse in Alexandria that's like this Supreme Court decision from like the 1850s. It's like 10 years after the retrocession, which was in the 1840s, which took place because DC, I'm pretty sure, Google this, but like because DC, not you, just anyone listening, because DC banned slavery, and Virginia and like Alexandria being on the river was like a big drop-off point for slaves and didn't want to have to ban slavery. So they like petitioned to rejoin Virginia and were allowed to do so because like the situation was very volatile on the national level at the time. But yeah, apparently other people have tried this, and like 10 years after it, the case did go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically said that like, while yeah, the legally retrocession was probably not all right, like it's just kind of the status quo and you have to go with it, which seems like bullshit to me, but that's why I didn't go to law school.
Well, but on the issue, I guess, of just like,
sorry, yeah, that was a tangent that
oh no, you're
anything.
fine.
It's just something interesting.
We're having a conversation. It's okay. But like, to me, what immediately came to mind though is because when you mentioned like these cultural issues and like the barstool types immediately like giving up, was that it's this weird, again, it goes back to that disparate thing because you had mentioned shoe on head, and the most surreal thing to see on my like Twitter timeline a couple months ago was that it was Blake Masters who had like quote tweeted a shoe on head like reply to him, and he did this whole.
He made a video and like said her name. He was like, "Good question, shoe on head."
Yeah, it was the good question, shoe on head. Here's what I want to do to make sure that you can have a family on a single income. And I was just like, this is the most surreal moment of like post 2020 online politics where this like sock dem populist Huey Long appreciator is getting a reply quote tweet with her name in a video from a Republican candidate for the Senate. But I mean, if there's going to be an overlay on a cultural issue, I mean, perhaps that could be the shoe on head staying power.
Well, that's my question. That's the thing, though. Like, I think that's going to be part of it. Is like, are the disaffected Bernie bros going to vote for like the pro-life Republican because he's going to like stick it to the corporations and like, bring back the jobs and stuff, like, because he's going to terrorize the financial sector and everything, like. Is that a trade-off that's worth it to them? Like, I don't know. Probably not, I would guess.
And I guess that's sort of the thing I've noticed is just really almost like a chicken or the egg question, where it's just like, okay, is the improvement of the material conditions going to restore the spiritual, cultural heart of things, or will the restoration of the cultural, spiritual heart of things give way to having the will to take back, on the material thing, and that's the thing that I'm really interested in, because I do hear from a lot of like shoe types or Marxist or sort of that sort of lens of like materialism, where they're like, yeah, like I think that you would accomplish that. And I'm like, well, it's great that you guys are talking about the material, but you're not having any concern for the spiritual or culture whatsoever.
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking a lot about too. I think that I think that. Right now, kind of where I'm at, like I'm very in flux on this, but I think the answer is that if you're making your dog take a pill, like I think the social conservatism is the pill, and the economic nationalism is the bacon you wrap it in, right? I think, I mean, at least in terms of winning electoral victories, like I think that if you get like. Because I'm an outlier in how much I care about the abortion issue. Like, if you survey people on like what their top issue is, if you're an incredibly devout evangelical who like goes to church every Sunday, or if you're a very devout like conservative Catholic or something, maybe abortion is your top issue. But like for most people, even people who consider themselves like Christians, like it's just not their top issue. And I mean, understandably so, just because it's not something that's in your face every day. Right. Like
you're Anglican, right?
Like any other building. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm a bad one, but yeah.
But go on. Like you're going.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll probably end up Catholic or Orthodox. I'll say that. Anglicanism is just kind of a way station for some people, but we'll see what happens. But yeah, so yeah, like I was saying, like abortion's not most people's like top issue. So I think that, you know, I think you probably can win elections as a pro-life candidate if you're also like advocating for policies that are going to meaningfully improve the material conditions of people's lives. And I don't think these issues are unrelated, right? Like I think that, you know, it goes back to the idea of what kind of society do we want to build? Like Vance said with the extra votes for children thing, like, do we want a society that's built so that, you know, deracinated millennial dog parents can, you know, live in a high rise and, you know, drink craft beers at the barcade and never reproduce, and work and make spreadsheets at a startup? Or do we want a society where people can do work they find meaningful, can support their family on a single income, can have kids and take care of those kids, and, you know, have those kids educated according to the values that they want them to be educated to, according to which they want them to be educated. That was weird. Trapped by my sentence structure there. And
go ahead. You had something
else. Like, which kind of society do we want? And, you know, I think that the abortion issue is wrapped up in that. Like, if we want a society where it really is just like this free for all of aimless attempts at self-actualization, then abortion makes sense with that society. Like, if it's a society built on families and on certain traditional values, then abortion doesn't make sense with that society.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you there. And this is the thing that kind of stuck out to me, was interesting, is this is where you'll get a lot of socially conservative-minded people. But again, it goes back to that small government mind virus that I think just needs to get eradicated. Because one of the earliest Twitter interactions I had was like Allie Beth Stuckley had made this like conversation about homeschooling. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, okay, great. That's a fantastic point that you're making. But what would your response be to like lower income working class people that want to have, you know, to homeschool their children? Because, like, let's face it, like, public school's a problem. Yeah. And she says, well, you know, you're just going to have to accept a lower quality of life if you want to accomplish it, mm-hmm. which I thought was just a very basic, don't be poor, just worded very differently. And I was like,
in many parts of the country, that's not even an option. And I mean,
it's not. And
you can say like, oh, just like move to a small town in a rural state and then you can afford it. But, you know, not everyone has that option, you know, like, obviously, you know, my wife and I living in the imperial capital, like, are not like an ideal test case, but we certainly can't do that. Like, we can't survive on one income.
Yeah. And I mean, even out here, like, if you wanted to go and do that, I mean, good luck trying to buy land to even just put a mobile starter home on, right? Like, that's almost impossible with land prices. And then, I mean, the one benefit here is that with small high trust communities is that people talk about their school board and what's happening in schools after church on Sunday. But I mean, that's an incredibly small percentage of the population. It just doesn't exist writ large for everybody. And like, this is where I think that the idea of, you know, implementing state power is not a bad thing, because, like, yes, there should be, like, you know, child tax income credits to where, like, you should be able to afford to homeschool your kids.
Yeah.
There should be, and this would be the greatest way to, like, take power away from the teachers unions at this point, is like, what power do you have if I can tell a bunch of disaffected teachers, I will give you a tax credit, or I won't tax your income for like the first 5 years if you join like a homeschooling association and you teach, like, you know, hundreds of like homeschooled children in like the suburbs. Yeah, like, that would stop deracination, I think, for a lot of kids and a lot of families in an instant.
I mean, in my mind, like, it's hard to imagine a more like abject failure than our modern public education system. There's that like famous thing of where in 100 years we went from teaching Latin in primary school to teaching remedial English in college. Like, it's just, yeah. If it was me, I would, because there's the argument of like, you know, and this is in one sense like the libertarian versus, like, I guess the more integralist like argument of like, oh, do we want to like do school choice, or do we want to just like make the public schools based? And this is like one of my few remaining libertarian opinions, which is like, just do school choice. Like, I understand the argument that like you need public schools to make a public, And there are things I love about public schools. I didn't go to one. Like, I went to a small private school in my hometown, but like I would go to the local public schools football games, and like I love going to public school football games. My wife is a teacher, and we went to a game, like pre-COVID, and it's just so fun. Like it just feels like one of the few areas of American life where you have this sense of like civic nationalism, where like very localized civic nationalism, where you have the game on the field and the marching band and the Pledge of Allegiance and the parents volunteering to sell hot dogs at the booth. Like it's a beautiful thing, and I love it. But at the same time, like that doesn't outweigh to me. Like if these are going to become indoctrination centers where you try to convince my child to chop his genitals off, like then sorry, I'm not sending there. And God, the outcomes are just so bad. Right before COVID, I was between jobs, and I was a substitute teacher at public school for about a month, teaching 6th grade, and they gave all of the kids iPads, which was the worst idea I've ever seen. And there were like very few restrictions on these. So like when I would teach, I'd have to like do a constant loop of the room to make sure they weren't like watching YouTube videos or on Discord or whatever, talking to each other. And it was just insane. And you could like take a kid's iPad if he was screwing around, but all their work was on their iPad. So like you had to give it back before the next class, or they couldn't do their work. And like, oh my gosh. And I remember going to like a Scholastic book fair because they had one that day, and like,
the good old days.
Yeah, exactly. And there was this whole display there where it was like, you shouldn't be encouraging your students to read graphic novels because graphic novels like help students with like visual literacy, which is an important skill in today's like highly digital visual world. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like like everything is on a screen for these kids. Like the like school is on a screen. When they're taking breaks, they're on screens. They go home and they're on screens. And like, it was just devastating. And you can tell the difference. Like, I don't know, like, I don't know if you ever like have occasion to talk to like 10 to 12-year-old kids, but if you talk to one who's like been raised with just smart devices in front of their face nonstop, and one who was raised like without screens in the home, it's night and day. Like, if you like, I've known 2 families who raised their kids without any screens at all, and at like the age of 11 or 12, you could have like full conversations with these children, and they were very interesting. Somebody said the kids were watching Prudentialist live streams. Leave them be. Okay, that's fine. That's allowed.
That's allowed. But no, like this is something that I've been talking about a lot. And in February, we had a sort of a conference type for a lot of people in our spheres to discuss this. And I've been sort of adamantly against like being. I am the touch grass guy because. It gets weird, right, when I think you hear internet lingo sort of like transcend the digital space into the IRL lexicon, which is really concerning, where it's just like, yeah, cool. Try explaining what the word based means to your mom or or what Lindy means. Like, good luck. But like the problem is with the overly online.
Lindy's just based for non-religious people.
Yeah, try. Based on what? Based on the word of God. But but that's the issue is that I think like it's a great way for ego, insecurity, neuroses, time suck, porn, like all the issues that we can talk about on a social level. Like they just get cranked up to 11 when you're on the internet, because it's like the world's your oyster at that point. And when you digitize schools, that also becomes the same problem. And I can't imagine how bad it is now. I mean, college is college, but I mean, like public school. I mean, I did military schools, like DOD stuff growing up overseas, but like I finished high school in a public high school in El Paso, Texas. And like your issue was like, one, like Mexican kids would just take their shirt off and start fighting each other. And then, but things were beginning to slowly get increasingly digitized, and, more computers, more laptops and things like that. I can only imagine how bad it's been since COVID, where they're talking about, the whole, everyone's like set back by 2 or 3 grade levels, which is already a bad standard.
Which already, like, most kids aren't reading a grade level. Like,
exactly.
There's some school system, some like inner city school system. I saw this like report recently where like 8% of kids, like 8th graders, were reading at grade level. And I was like, why does this system get another penny of taxpayer money? Like,
Well,
well, obviously, yeah, because it's corrupt, but just like anyone with sense would be like, okay, this system is abolished. You are all fired. Like, here's a voucher. Like, figure it out.
well, and that goes
Like, the
back to
market will respond.
the rage thing, right? Like retire all government employees. I think that just equally applies to the school system. Like,
Mhm.
like you're fired if you'd like to go teach at if you want to go apply for a private school, or if you want to go like find a homeschooling association, the world's your oyster. But I mean, the other thing though is that, and this is something that I don't know how much this new right thing wants to address, because again, there's these so many disparate factions, but like, a lot of politics and a lot of its voting and electoral system, whatever still exists of it, that you can remotely have any faith in, right? Like our polity is still based upon, economics and of course demographics. Like, and that's the thing with like the school system that I just don't know how you can do. Like if, and this is the thing where, it gets, and this goes back to the civil rights regime, right? Where even George W. Bush was talking about No Child Left Behind. And, he was talking about how this was the, civil rights issue of the age. And where even Corey DeAngelis, I think at one point had mentioned that like this is a civil rights issue about school vouchers and school choice.
Well, I mean, like, I think I agree with him to a degree there, though, because like, there is this issue where, if you're a poor black kid in a poor black neighborhood, like you're stuck in the garbage school that you're in. And like, if the next school district over is all, affluent, white families with the in this house we believe sign in their yard, of course they're all good progressives that like, that posted the black square on Instagram and everything. But if you want to like talk about giving the kids in the next district the opportunity to come to this school, like they're just, they just clutch their pearls immediately.
Yeah, so, that NIMBY thing is going to stick around for like white liberals until the end of the earth.
Yeah, the most like progressive, like, lily white suburbs are the most NIMBY, which is hilarious. But yeah, no, I mean, if I was in that situation, I'd absolutely want a chance to get my kid out of there.
Well, and it goes
back. Where I'm at now is just like cut the public school budget by like half and just give it out as vouchers and let people figure other stuff out, because like what we're doing is not working.
Well, and that's that would be like a state issue, right? Because like most, it's like 90, it's like a 90-10 split.
Like if the public schools were based, I wouldn't hate public schools, but like,
well,
it's a question of what time it is, and with what time it is, like this society is so polarized that we can't have public schools, which is a whole other issue of like, well, is that a healthy society? And the answer is no. But
well, and it goes back to the patron and incentivism, incentives thing, wherein goodness, the spam bots are out today in the chat. But it goes back to the incentives thing and what keeps your patron structure in line, because you want to talk about sort of like inner city schools or the cultural issues. It's just, and that's where you start having to have uncomfortable conversations, is that, you take a look at like the amount of growing black middle class in the 1960s, like 2-parent households, drug use, crime, like 1965 to today, it's a night and day difference, where there was no progress from 1965 to today. Like you destroyed black culture in America. Like that, to me, that's the cultural genocide. Like I think that's evil. And this goes back to like the material and the spiritual condition. It's just like the state created the material conditions to create a permanent patron class, to take that apocryphal quote from LBJ and just make it sound nice for YouTube. And that's the problem that we're in. It's just that until like, and this is where this is the problem that I think like Blexit and all those other groups has. It's like, great, you can't. It's the same thing that kind of happened in a lot of ways, I think, with like with what Rand and Ron Paul said with the Iraq War. Like you can't take an Iraqi politician and turn him into a Jeffersonian Democrat overnight. In the same way that I don't think we can take like a group of people in the country that have just been so completely obliterated by the Great Society in the name of progress, because the argument has always been, as the blogger Spandrel put it, like if you don't play by the game, then it's going to be back to 1959. It's okay to be white and you have no one in your corner, and that's really the problem that I really do see here.
Well, I mean, it's truly crazy if you look at like what do black women vote, like 95% Democrat or something like that? It's like if you step back for a second and are like, oh my goodness, like how is any like demographic group voting this much with one party? It's like there's something going on here, you know.
Well, and again, this goes back to and I kind of think that circles back to sort of the abortion issue. Is like, you've destroyed the culture, you've destroyed all material ends, and we don't do anything about it. Like we talk about gun crime as this sort of almost as if this, like, you know, whatever kind of political homily that you'll see out of Chicago or wherever. And it's just like nothing will get done, because why would you want to fix a problem that creates make work jobs, creates this incentive? And now you can expand the grift even further with, you know, diversity, inclusion, and equity.
Yeah, there's I'm reading right now, the novel Diary of a Country Priest by George Bernanos. It's really good. It's came out in the 1930s, I think. George Bernanos was like a conservative Catholic French writer. The book's just this diary that a priest is keeping in a small like country parish in France as he's having like a mental breakdown. But it's very good. But there was this passage where he talks about like a society in decay that just like throws endless resources and endless amounts of ingenuity into these programs to like solve all these social problems, and none of it works. Like you draw up new educational curricula and new programs to fix alcoholism or substance abuse or whatever. You can do all these things, but like if there's something like rotten at the core of your society, nothing's going to fix that. I mean, that's kind of like what I think about the gun issue is like you could order a you could order a rifle through the Sears catalog with like no registration or anything, like, you know, or like in the early 20th century, and like kids weren't taking those into schools and killing their friends and killing their classmates, you know. I think like there's some spiritual sickness in our society that's causing this, and like, okay, yeah, maybe if you just disarmed everyone, it would solve that problem, but like then we'd just be living like in an asylum where the inmates can't be trusted to have weapons, you know, like it's not going to address the underlying spiritual sickness.
Well, yeah, you'd get turned into sort of the running meme about Brits making fun of American gun laws, where it's just like nail bomb goes off. Aren't you glad? Oh, acid attack happens that you don't have guns, you know, get stabbed, you know, like that sort of stuff. Like the same thing that would happen.
Where there's the thing where it's like the Bobby knocks on my door and it's like unlocks my door. Oh, you got the permit for that lock?
Yeah, right.
You got a license for that permit?
You have a license for your butter knife. But that's something I think that you're right, and this is something that this new right, this neo-reactionary right, whatever it wants to call itself. I'm always ambivalent about labels, because I can't do anything about what my opponents or enemies are going to label me. Like there was someone that had like by happenstance,
they're just going to call us fascists.
Well, no, it's exactly what happened. Someone that I knew from my IRL had like found the account, and like I used to have like civil conversations with this person back in like before Trump in college, and then like I immediately blocked this person because like they're like a dyed-in-the-wool liberal now, and I just like scrolled through his like Twitter account real quick, and he says, you scroll through fascist Twitter for a few minutes and you'll find familiar names and voices, and I was just like, for the love of God. But like I can't control what my enemies will label me, but I can control what I call myself, and like I say that I'm friendly to the right, but like I don't give myself a title, because people will always look for a title as a way to dismiss you. Like I just say that like I adhere to the realist school of international relations, and I'm a catechumen to the Orthodox Church. Like there's nothing more that you're going to find out. If you want my opinions, you can have a conversation with me and listen to what I like put out. But that's the thing that I'm noticing with this Vanity Fair piece is that it's the new right, as if we haven't had a new right every
I honestly like that. I like that label just because it's so amorphous, you know, and it's been used before, right? Like it's a nothing. It's like a placeholder, and I think that's good. You know, the minute you start trying to nail it down, you know, you murder to dissect, right?
Exactly.
Let's just see what it is. Let's see what it's going to be.
Yeah, and that's where you'll have to really just put it out there and to make sense of it all. And so to sort of like get towards the article here, I think that they really do have some points here where, they had this line where I think he was talking to the author was talking about JD Vance. And he was just saying, like, I don't see you as a member of the elite because you're like an independent journalist or whatever. But maybe he's despair serves the regime. And that really does become the thing here, because a lot of people will criticize like this new right or this like clear pill argument or this whatever you want to call this sort of circle or sphere or whatever. It's like this permanently black pilled, that there's no solution type deal. What I mean, I think this article kind of shows that maybe not that there's like this like real that there will be some regime change or overthrow, but that there is an accumulation of power. Orrin McIntyre was on Tim Pool a while back, and he says really what most people would like is just some basic competence. Like for most people that aren't the op-ed writers or the YouTube political commentariat of the world. Most people don't have very strongly swayed opinions, which I think is also another issue that we can talk about culturally, right? Like, people used to like, there's no way in heck 60 years ago in the 1960s, like for a majority of people, it was like this 90-something%, conservative, like evangelical country. There's no way in heck that they didn't have strongly held beliefs and positions. And I think we've become so deracinated spiritually that you have seen this like widespread move for a lot of young men to like older Christian traditions. Like Catholicism and Orthodoxy, especially, because like I didn't come through it by watching Jay Dyer clips. I came through it because I was in the hospital and I talked to a deacon for who was also in the hospital. Like that's how I came this way. It wasn't because a lot of people do watch those clips or whatever and they go to it or they find something with Catholicism and go there. But I went to
this guy seems like a dick.
Oh, to me, I have personal reservations to him, but I'm not I won't unload that here. But like I went to St. Seraphim's Cathedral in Dallas a while back for Holy Unction service. And like half the crowd, well, maybe like 30% of the crowd, all men under 30. Like white men, some Ethiopian guys, all under 30. They're all here to find, like, we become that culturally deracinated that, and the criticism that you'll hear a lot from, I think, Protestants and other like right wingers that are maybe more atheist or just like, well, you come here because like it's not American. Like, why would you go there? And I think it's because like America has become so spiritually deracinated that, like icon worship, like reciting the Nicene Creed, like the liturgy, like that all sounds like a great way to get like some sort of grounding or an anchor, which it does. Go to church. But I think that's something that is present, at least in some form or fashion, with maybe JD Vance and others, is that why give up? Because as much as I don't like Michael Malice, he had this perfect line where he had said, "They would like you dead, but they'll settle for your submission." And so why despair and fret if you're gonna just submit yourself that way spiritually?
Yeah. Well, do we want to? I don't know. Do we want to maybe like respond to a few comments or take a few questions or something?
There was there was a super chat here that I'll just go through. It was from if I can reset my there we go. Okay, cool. He says DOH917 for $5 US. Thank you. He says the Democrats go after red industries, energy, guns, tobacco, etc. The Reds are going after abortion and Planned Parenthood. It seems to encapsulate a lot of these battles. And yeah, right. Like that is a point to make. Is that yes, the Rust Belt is now the Rust Belt. They don't do anything about the border, so that your neighbors get high on heroin and die. And we've gotten to a point in like 15 years where no one knew what Narcan was, to where people are saying you should have like Narcan on your person at all times.
No, yeah. In DC, you can like go get some at CVS for free, just so you like have it if somebody like ODs in front of you.
Good God. This is where the Oswald Spengler decline meme should just be perfectly applicable. And that's another thing, right? With the new right is that all these old writers and ideas come back. Like, and that's another one that will get tweeted a lot, is Oswald Spengler had said that, when a society determines that having children is open up for discussion, like it's a choice, that's when your civilization goes downhill.
Good. Yep. But yeah, I mean, I I'd maybe take issue with the like classification of like red industries. Like I get what he's saying, that these are like things that are, you know, generally considered like, you know, they're producing products, guns that are considered like a right-wing political thing, or, you know, tobacco, where it's typically targeted by like democratic administrations that are more hardcore on regulation. But I don't know that there is such a thing as like red industries, right? Like if you look at the corporate responses to the draft ruling from the Supreme Court, like there's two responses. There's like full-throated support for abortion, and like we'll pay for our employees to go out of state and get them, including from Elon Musk, by the way. I hope he enjoyed his 2 seconds as a conservative icon. And you know, silence is the other option. Like if you could name me one corporation that has said like, we love this Supreme Court ruling, I would love to hear about it.
Well, I guess that
does not exist.
Well, I wonder what Hobby Lobby said then.
That would be maybe the one exception, but it's like you have to realize like how stacked the deck is. Like,
oh yeah,
you know, Olivia Rodrigo got up on stage and was like, "Oh, like this is horrible, and we need to like preserve a woman's right to choose," or whatever. Like there's no comparably large, you know, popular musician that's going to make a statement for the other side in that way. And I think this is why like the you know, reactionary chic thing exists, because like if you want to be subversive and you want to be like, you know, pop punk or whatever, it's like, and you know, if you want to be punk rock and you have the same values as the Fortune 500, like you have to at some point look in the mirror and realize that you're a phony.
Yeah, Rage Against the Machine immediately comes to mind about their $500 tickets and you know, vaccinated only venues. Like, yeah, you're raging against the machine by licking the boot. Like that's a you know, and that's the other thing is it's just that I can't help but wonder, you know, what is to come with this. Like it's having like the mainstream media has finally made it a target where it wasn't just like the doxing of Curtis back in 2013 where they called him like the Silicon Valley Reich, you know. Like clearly
sorry, finish your point, but can I respond to another comment afterwards?
Oh yeah.
Just like to respond to non-super chats.
Okay. Yeah, sure. There's plenty. But no, like to finish off there, it's like now that it's sort of in this sort of cultural moment where all this attention and networking is kind of being focused, it's just it feels very reminiscent to when like the Open Data and Society Foundation did that like networking for like YouTubers back in like 2016, and things really got throttled. It'll be curious to see what comes out of it now.
Yeah, God, I remember that like huge YouTube revolt that happened around that time. That was intense. So I wanted to respond to Oscar Toe here. He said either JD is a fraud or he masterfully 4D chessed the left into making him a millionaire off his book and Hollywood film before turning on the MSNBC crowd. That's a really good comment. I don't know if I'd go for either. Like my sense of him, and one reason that I've actually, you know, liked him so much and followed him with such interest is that I think his evolution mirrors that of a lot of people. You know, I kind of take what he says at face value, because to me it sounds very plausible. Where, yeah, in 2016 he was the Never Trump guy because, you know, you still have this idea that like these are the rules of the game and Trump is not playing by these rules, and that makes people nervous. And I think understandably so. Like, I mean, when it was 2016 and I was like just out of college and Trump was saying like, oh yeah, I'll accept the results of the election if I win, I was like, oh, that's scary, as someone who the day before was like, oh, we're living in a totally functional liberal democracy here, like who hadn't sort of seen the you know, the wires yet, and hadn't seen the way that, wasn't aware that the game was rigged in the way that it was. And I mean, you can say that I was naive and stupid for not realizing it sooner. Like, I don't know, I was 22 and I wasn't paying that much of attention before. I just kind of accepted, you know, what I was always on the right, but I just kind of accepted what I was told from mainstream sources. And I think that JD Vance saw that Trump was, you know, changing the conversation in a lot of ways, and that he was really being the champion, or at least being perceived as the champion. You know, you can make the argument that he like kind of governed as a more normie Republican president, where like his biggest legislative accomplishment was, you know, Bush and Reagan style tax cuts. But you know, that at least like he was perceived as a champion for the people that Vance like grew up with and wanted to help as a politician. If you know, attribute such altruistic motives to him, you don't have to, but yeah, I just think that it's a very understandable transformation to have over time, and I don't think you need to. I'm sure some of it was cynical. Like, I'm sure he didn't love, you know, sucking up to Trump as much as he did to try to get that endorsement.
That's part of the game.
But yeah, it's part of the game. But like, I think his evolution ideologically from kind of the never Trump guy to the new right darling is something that you could see as organic and as genuine. I mean, it mirrors my own kind of thinking since 2016, certainly.
Oh, same. I mean, in 2015, leading up to the primaries, I was in college, like my second year, and I was just like, I was kind of like, there's no way that the Republican establishment is going to let this guy win after how hard they shafted Ron Paul in like the 2012 primary at the convention. And then when he won, and I was just like, oh, I'm still like, oh, this is a little different. Like, this is my word, like libertarian, like growing up as a military family, having weird nostalgia for Bush. But like, I was like, I held my nose and I voted for him full, like straight ticket in 2016. And then sort of after he got elected, and then after watching how like everything that he talked about was systematically denied or stopped by some procedural BS, I was like, okay, like clearly like there's something more to this. And that's sort of how I started getting to where I am now, was just really how shafted any sort of policy goal, like kicking out of Steve Bannon, the weird Jared Kushner Ivanka thing. I was like, okay, like we've got to, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's good to show grace to people who got to where you are a little later than you did, you know.
Yeah.
I don't think it really serves any valuable purpose to be like, oh yeah, well 2 years ago you thought this. It's like, yeah, the people change their minds on things. Like, be glad that, you know, I'm on your side now. Like, it becomes a different issue when you're sort of adopting that as a pose and then using that as a platform from which to like subvert the side that you've supposedly joined or the movement that you've supposedly joined or whatever, you know, like people who like IDW types who were like, oh yeah, I'm leaving the left and now I'm going to exclusively use this platform to punch right type thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
But, like, criticism of them is totally valid. But if you're just like, oh, you know, it's if you're just criticizing them for not coming to the conclusions you came to at the same time you came to them, like, shut up, you know?
Yeah. No, and I mean,
you, Oscar, just imagine planting a naysayer. I'm
well,
not saying that's what
there's plenty of people like that are just like, oh, you're not on board with 100% that we say. Like, I play very diplomatically. Like, I have like, I'm in the periphery of like 5 different circles. Like, with like the Amanda Milnes thing that was in the article, like, oh, like half of my mutuals like talk to her exclusively, like that, you know. Like, I'm friendly with that sphere. I know a lot of people from, say, the IDW crowd. I know a lot of people that are far more old fashioned, like, you know, the far right, alt-right stuff from the olden days. It's just like, but at the same time, it's just like, I don't really, you know, like, I come to a different conclusion. That doesn't mean that I have to be 100% on board with you, even if you and I say something that I might agree with. It's just, and that's again the interesting thing about this sort of neo-reactionary Curtis Yarvin, Peter Thiel right wing that has sort of come out from this article. It's just like, what will be the through line? Because, you know, Yarvin's trying to defend his weird startup CEO monarchy thing, but I just, and meanwhile, Michael Anton, and this is like, it's funny where people like, you know, Dave Rubin or Jack Murphy got mentioned in this article, because it's just like, okay, you have a gay man
kind of shafted his career, didn't he?
They sure, very literally. But like Murphy, before all of that stuff kind of became way more public, he had hosted this sort of like debate and conversation between Curtis Yarvin and Michael Anton about Caesarism. And I think that is still a discussion that this new right thing is going to have, because like, you know, clearly every bureaucratic institution is against you. I do think that rage is a fantastic policy proposal. If anyone who's in charge should just fire everybody, and if the Supreme Court says something, then just pull a full, you know, Jackson and just say, well, let them enforce it. But what comes afterwards, right? Because
yeah, well, I'm really nervous about that though, because like right now I really want them to comply with the Supreme Court.
Yeah, right, and that's the thing. It's about like institutional legitimacy. It's just like because the most famous thing that I think Yarvin, well, there's plenty of famous things that Yarvin has written, but one of my favorite comes from the open letter. Is that it's just like he was talking about this thing that he wrote, and it's just about the manipulation of procedural outcomes to get a desired result. And like that's what the left is really good at, and that's the criticism that he sort of levied about with Chris Rufo was just like, cool, you can ban CRT, and he made this like conversation about he's like, okay, so say like they were offering like basically sterilizing all boys at the public school, and you get it banned, but they come up with this procedural exception so they can still like put it in the Jello or whatever, like those things do exist. So it'll just definitely be, I guess, interesting to see what the future holds for this, because it sounds like you're getting important conversations out there into sort of the body politic about like CRT, and that things are kind of anti-white and you should be addressing those things. Like in a way, a lot of the sort of what was called the alternative right 1.0 kind of has its victory in 2022, where those things are now part of the mainstream discussion. The question is this just a flash in the pan? Oh, this politician's throwing some money around, or are they actually accumulating political power?
One thing I'm really interested to see in the future, just kind of as a trivial thing, but like I'm interested to see how this starts getting laundered through like sort of normie media products type things. Because I mean, there was like, you had a long span where there were like kind of analogs to like the Cokes in like political TV shows.
Mm-hmm.
Where it was like, oh, these people are like flooding the scene with dark money, and that's so insidious, and like all this stuff. Like,
do you remember the newsroom about the whole Koch brothers thing? That was awful.
Yeah, and there was on like the last season of House of Cards, which made no sense to me. Like it was like unintentional surrealist cinema. Like it, but there was some like Koch analog characters who were like brother and sister, and like somehow like bought this Democratic administration. It made no sense, but I'm curious to see like if there's something similar that happens with the new right, where kind of the official ideology of our society sort of tries to launder and present that to kind of a mainstream audience that might not be necessarily familiar with it as an intellectual movement in a certain way.
So I don't know if you've seen this clip, but there is a clip of that TV show not Sherlock, but the one in America with like the bald guy and the Asian Dr. Watson, which is a female.
Oh, Elementary, right?
Yeah, Elementary. There you go. Thank you. Apparently they had a clip where they had used this like librarian blogger guy as a stand-in for Curtis Yarvin, where he's like this criminal mastermind that makes references about wanting to reinstall some Tudor-style monarchy in the 21st century, and like the Watson guy is just like, well, I truly do think that democracy is the best form of government above all others, and I'm like, there's going to be more of that in the future.
Yeah, no, I think so, because I think in I didn't watch it, but in the Netflix movie Don't Look Up, I think there was a character who was like the right-wing billionaire who like was stopping the government from blowing up the asteroid because he wanted to like send drones up to like mine the metals from it or something, but his name was like David Cyan or something. Cyan Teal,
Yeah, I haven't seen it, and if I were to ever talk about it, I'm going to just do what Slavoj Žižek did for this new Matrix movie. I'm going to review it without watching it.
Is that what Žižek did? I need to read that. That sounds
I just saw like the image of it, and he was just like, yeah, I'm going to review The Matrix 4, and because I think it's such terrible cinema, I'm going to review the film without watching it.
I think it was, I forget who it was. There was some like commentator. I want to say it was Ross Douthat, but I think I'm wrong. But it was somebody who was like, I'm going to predict before it comes out that the message of the fourth Matrix movie is that the Matrix is good, actually. And like they saw it and just like came back and like responded to their own tweet. And we're like, yep.
It doesn't surprise me in the slightest that was the argument being made, and that for everything that I heard about it was very like tongue in cheek about like video game programmers and like why the Matrix is good because most people can't wake up or whatever. Like, and that's where you're at though too, right? Is that this is sort of the the argument that this circle has talked about. And I've ordered the book, but I haven't read it yet. I did buy Academic Agents, The Populist Delusion. And, basically that the argument is that, like, yeah, things are done by small organized minorities. And clearly, there is an organized minority where, like, they just work in film, they work in that. It's all these people striving for incentives to power. And and the neat thing, I think, that makes the American politic scene so interesting is that all these organized minorities in various fields, the media, or the artistic sector, education, is that they're all kind of unified in like this left-wing fusionism of like intersectionality. That like you've managed to connect veganism, environmentalism, racial justice, police reform, prison reform, redistributive class reductionist economics into this like unified political theology that is this like really bastardized form of Christianity.
Yeah, this is one thing I'm like still trying to work out, and I wonder if you have any like insights on it. Is like I see this whole movement toward like transhumanism, right? Where it's abortion, it's technology, right? Like it's smartphones and eventually like moving toward implants, which like actually isn't that different from a smartphone realistically. Like, if you can't drive anywhere without like looking at your phone on your dashboard to help you navigate, like, is it really that different than if like you just like saw an arrow on the road through your eyes? Like it's still filtering the way you experience reality through through a technological medium. Like, yes, your sense experience of the world isn't altered by having the phone on your dashboard, but like you're not seeing the road and the place you're driving through in the same way if you're using Google Maps as if you're navigating from memory. But yeah, so anyway, sorry, tangent. It's abortion, it's transgenderism, it's technology, it's all this stuff. And then like I'm having trouble like really squaring the like simultaneous insistence on like this like race essentialism, right? Because like you would think if like the program is transhumanism, then like you'd have a lot, then like the whole Rachel Dolezal thing would be like more of a thing, I guess. But I don't know, it's just a movement that seems oddly like incongruous to the rest of where I see society going. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, because it's something I'm trying to figure out.
Well, and that's sort of the thing that I've kind of found interesting with like the AI or algorithms that they tried to do to like Facebook did that thing, that study right with like hate speech, and then they're like, oh, they found out that like minorities were like the biggest like proponents or users of it. Like the transhumanist thing, like this is where I get really like, this is where you'll get sort of like the lib right sort of libertarian types, where it's just like, yeah, transhumanism, innovation, like let's get my cyberpunk dystopia going as fast as possible. But at the same time, it's just like, let's not, like this is the thing. I'm strangely anti-transhumanist, like, and not like I'm not like a complete Luddite, but it's just like I fall into the Paul Virilio sphere that the creation of a new technology inevitably leads to the discovery of the new accident. If we haven't already had our genetic Hiroshima, and I'll leave it at that in regards to a certain medical sacrament, then we're pretty darn close with like Neuralink or whatever. Like I'm very skeptical, both for religious but also just basic like destruction of the species.
Well, there's the whole microplastics thing too.
Well, that too, right? And like
I'm terrified I'm terrified to learn the full truth about that.
Well, I mean, and that's the other thing. They're like, we found it in deep lung tissue for the first time in humans, and I'm like, well, what have we been wearing on our faces for the last 2 months? 2 years, right? Like that's another thing that comes to mind. And like all the health issues are also beginning to emerge, where the seed oils discussion, which has turned into kind of this meme, but I mean, that's also very legitimate. But
yeah,
I don't like the accelerationism of like, let's just get there, let's crash the machine, because if you drive fast enough, you'll derail, and then like we can go back to normal or go make something better of it. I just think that that's going to have something incredibly dangerous, because like
this was like my final break with the libertarians that I was like kind of in doing stuff with for a while, was like, if we because they were One of the scholars that I was like working under was his big thing was the idea of permissionless innovation, and how like societies that allow permissionless innovation was his term, like tend to have more startups that turn into unicorns or whatever the term is. And like but I was like, okay, sure, and like these startups create jobs and everything, but at the end of the day, like if you're moving fast and breaking things, eventually you are going to break something that we can't fix, and we won't realize it's broken until it's too late, right? It's like the classic argument from C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, which I think is probably the most prescient book of the 20th century. Like,
well, and this is something I've said a lot actually, is that like where we're at right now digitally, like C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man is going to see its logical conclusion to the atomization of man.
mm-hmm.
And like we're pretty much there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that like, yeah, this technology is cool, but it's also a digital Skinner box and prison that I carry on my person 24/7.
Mm-hmm.
And any further integration needs to be addressed, because America's cybersecurity is also another problem, but that could be a discussion for a later date. But I'm about maybe 15, 20 minutes out before I've got to take my anti-rejection meds. So I was maybe some final thoughts.
Sure, yeah. I wanted to say, you're holding up your phone. Have you read, do you know Paul Kingsnorth, the fellow, he's a British writer and like fellow convert to Orthodoxy, actually. But he wrote this really cool short story called The Basilisk, where it's partially based on his own experience before he converted to Orthodoxy. He like, really interesting story. He came up through like the radical environmental movement in Britain, and like, but he felt this like deeply intense connection to nature, and like wanted to explore the more religious side of the environmental movement, and ended up becoming like a Wiccan or a witch for a while or something, and like would go do these rituals in the forest. And he doesn't talk much about specifics, but he says like, things really happened at these rituals. And he's kind of drawing on that, where he, in this short story where he's writing, the story is done as like a letter from this guy who's a college professor who studies the occult, writing to his daughter about his granddaughter, who's like 13 and just constantly on her phone, about how he thinks phones are literally a tool of demons to like destroy the human race.
Well, I mean, you'll see that get posted a lot in sort of esoteric or schizo Twitter, where it's just like, oh, computers aren't real. We've commissioned demons to be inside pieces of plastic. Like there's, I haven't read the story, but someone in chat adequately pointed
somebody asked if it's Seraphim Rose. It's Paul Kingsnorth is the name. Kind of Seraphim Rose vibes, though, for sure. Yeah. Paul Kingsnorth, yeah.
But someone in chat pointed out you can't tell people about the basilisk. They didn't say the full name. We'll be fine.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know if you see any more questions you want to grab before we jump off. If not, we can just do like some final thoughts and hop off.
Well, yeah, let's just go for that then. I think that the article is interesting because it wasn't done in a completely negative way, but I can't say it was rather level-headed and on balance. Yeah. I do think that the real question comes is that now that it's sort of having its cultural moment, whether it's this reactionary chic and this aesthetic and the politics and this philosophy that is, for better or for worse, here to stay. I think that there's things that you can take away from Curtis Yarvin. I just don't find his solutions to be particularly all that great. So I guess the question becomes like, what will become of this? Is this a flash in the pan, or is this going to have any kind of staying power? Those are my thoughts, and that'll be a question that I do want to keep examining in the future.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm like a huge Yarvinite either. I've like familiarized myself somewhat with his thinking. I should probably read a little bit more. But if you'd asked me like a week ago if this had staying power, I'd say I don't know. Like I'd say, yeah, this might just be reactionary chic. This might just be some people in Brooklyn who are converting to Catholicism because it's edgy, who are like where everything's wrapped in like 7 layers of like ironic post irony or whatever. But after I know I keep coming back to this, but like after JD Vance won his primary, it's like, okay, this does have staying power. Like this could be a thing, and I think to be a thing, what it needs to do is it needs to fuse with MAGA in a way that works out. the best way for that to happen, I think, would be for the best way for that to happen, I think, would be for Trump just not to run again. I would think, just because then you could have the movement go forward with Trump's backing without with the full benefit of the personality cult he's built, without his personality cult becoming front and center once again. But even if Trump does win again, I think there's a chance it could move forward, but then it's more of a toss-up because it would depend on him being surrounded by allies who shared the priorities that you're seeing from the new right. And, when it comes to Trump and having people around him who are going to get him to pursue a certain agenda, that was just pure chaos in the whole first term, where he was pulled in different directions by advisors with different agendas. And, you had incredibly high turnover. There was the whole thing of when he appointed Bannon, this is going to be the Steve Bannon presidency, and he was out within a few months. So
yeah.
really,
it'll come down to the managers.
Yeah, it's really hard to tell if it's going to have staying power if Trump moves forward. Once JD Vance becomes president, they're going to have staying power. For a journalist. Thank you, Oscar.
Yeah, I saw that. I have your Twitter link down below in the description, but by all means, give your pitch to the audience since we're.
Oh yeah, sure. So you can find me on Twitter at Hemingway. If you want to come follow me, then when people when people make fun of me on Twitter, instead of saying I'm a 650 follower blue check, maybe they could say I'm a 700 follower blue check if a couple of you follow me. And then I also do my opinion writing at the Spectator World. So if you just Google my name and Spectator, my author page will come right up. My day job is at The Week, but I don't do opinion writing there. So, if you're interested in what I think, that's probably not the best place to go. I also have a website that's just GraysonQuay.com where you have links to all my author pages.
Yeah, so by all means, do give him a follow. I was really lucky to meet Grayson via Break the Rules BTR on a conversation about the word based, and it kind of all worked out the way that it did. So Grayson, thank you really so much for coming on. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you so much, sir.
And then for the audience, stay tuned, because on Wednesday I'll have another fishing video up for you all to enjoy. It's sort of my quarterly white pill dispensary working again. So until then, ladies and gentlemen, I will see you all next time. Take care and be prudent, everybody.